And we're off.
All right, welcome everybody to a new episode of the EP podcast. Today we have a special guest once again.
And
it's
I wouldn't necessarily say special. maybe special needs.
special. It's none other than MoFoBodyMechanic, Aaron Caseley, if I'm correct, if I'm pronouncing that right.
You are indeed, yeah. Most people know me as Mo or Mofo.
Yeah.
Jonathan asked me what Mofo stood for, and I said motherfucker.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
It's basically
When you've got an elbow in somebody's glute,
motherfucker.
that's pretty much what they call you. Yeah.
Just a quick introduction from my side. I've been working with Mofo for what's that, like 7 weeks now, 8 weeks?
Yeah, about 7-8 weeks.
For my bicep tendonitis. I followed him for a longer time on Instagram as well. Really aligned with his vision and his like message around treating injuries and how to rehab. But the man's going to introduce himself, so Mofo, go ahead, take the stage.
Right, so as Don said, I'm Mofo or Mo to my friends. I suppose, qualification-wise, I started off working in the Air Force. So I was in the Royal Air Force for 6 years as a strength and conditioning coach. My last posting was what got me into rehab. So I worked at a place called Headley Court, which is a tri-service rehabilitation centre. So we were dealing with people who'd had amputations, spinal cord injuries, head injuries, pretty serious, nasty injuries. Yeah. And I found that the same things that I'd used to, I suppose, break recruits, I was using to fix people who'd had, pretty serious injuries. So that got me into kind of rehab. I did my undergraduate degree. I did a master's degree. I'm currently trying to get funding to do a PhD in tendon and muscle physiology. So muscles, tendons are my, I suppose, specialism.
That's why I said special guest.
Yeah.
Special guests, special needs.
And
special needs, yeah.
If you wanna check him out real quick before you listen to this podcast any further, check out MoFoBodyMechanic on IG. Just look at a couple of his posts and you'll see how much knowledge this guy has around rehab. And then obviously come back to this podcast and listen, because we're going to talk about some fun stuff today, some interesting stuff around.
Yeah, I think I'd like to try and help people to avoid making the same mistakes that a lot of the people I see make. Yeah. So I'd like to try and use this as an opportunity to try and educate people around, training, how to build muscle. I'm assuming that most of the guys listening to this, guys and girls listening to this, hypertrophy, building a physique is their primary goal.
Yeah.
And I think, and I think as we've demonstrated with you, Dan, you're in prep currently. And what we've done with your shoulder, you actually said just before we came on camera that you're growing as you're going through prep.
Yep.
So even whilst rehabbing, we can still build tissue, because what we're doing is prioritizing recovery. We'll talk about that, if you like, in a little bit of time.
Yeah, 100%. That's very interesting to go into, because let me just open it up by telling my story a little bit so we can dig deeper into that. Right. I've been bodybuilding for, I'd say, altogether, maybe 10 years. Periods where I was more serious and periods where I was less serious. And right now I've been at it for, I'd say, 3 or 4 years in a row, where I've been consistently training, using gear and all that stuff. Most of which I've been training at a lower volume, higher intensity type training, which we all know is popularized by Dante Trudel, Jordan Peters.
Yeah.
Which obviously no disrespect to that. It's a very effective way of training. We can see that in the people who do so, especially Jordan Peters himself.
Yep.
But at some point I started, developing more wrong type of pains than I was developing new muscle tissue. And the only thing I would then do is just either back off and to come back but not be recovered, or start adding in some extras such as like peptides, BPC, TB.
Yeah.
Maybe adding some MPP like we just spoke about, or DECA.
Yep.
Just like patches to fix that problem, where the root cause was really in the way of training. I mean, at least for that time, right? And this is something that Mofo and I talked about, and he was like, okay, so why don't you go and lower that intensity, go more a little bit in towards more volume, more time and attention, and give your body the ability to actually recover itself, the tendons the ability to recover, and then you will be able to eventually reload them and go to higher intensities if you want to. But that's the only way you're going to get rid of the problem. So that's everything in a nutshell. But I'm sure Mofo has more to say about it.
Well, I think what springs to mind as you're talking about that, there's a common saying: what built the muscle in the off season will hold on to the muscle during prep.
Yeah.
And I hear that bandied around a lot of times. And I think if you think about this logically, off season, calories are high. Usually the kind of load from the anabolics is low because your food is so high. So you've not got the systemic load that you've got during prep. So I think during periods of your off season, I think you can probably get away with that kind of training. I think that's the kind of stuff. But when you look at prep, you're in a calorie deficit. Anabolics are higher because you're trying to use those to hold on to the muscle tissue to maintain that positive nitrogen balance. And yet we continue to train the same way as we did in the off season when the internal environment was completely different. And I think that for me is where most people pick up their injuries. And I think it's because you're overtraining and under recovering. I think that's the primary issue.
Yeah, that's the essence of it.
Yeah, that's the essence of it. Now, this isn't taking anything away from JP and Dante Trudel, Mike Metzner, who was again Arthur Jones, who again sort of advocated this kind of high intensity type training. But I think these guys, if you look at like say JP for example, JP spends a lot of time injured. I mean, I know he's not competitive at the moment. He took a step to the side slightly in terms of his bodybuilding career. But if you look at anybody that's trained in that format, 9 times out of 10, their career has been ended through injury.
Yes.
Look at Dorian Yates, Ronnie Coleman. Look at Jay Cutler, who used to use more volume-based approaches to build muscle, and Jay still looks fantastic at nearly 50.
Yeah, he never had an injury, right?
Yeah, 100%. And I think we've all been kind of brainwashed into believing there's only one way to build muscle, and that's using the progressive overload or linear progression model. And I think that's just one facet of building muscle.
Yeah. And we have more examples, right? If we look at Dexter Jackson, same
Absolutely.
thing.
Yeah.
Also longevity and maybe as effective if you look at like the actual size they carry, obviously. People will also say like, the higher intensity type of training will create a different look to the muscle. This is something people say, like you'll get denser muscle tissue.
More of a grainy look as they describe it, isn't it? So it's like it's grainy.
I'm not like convinced that is actually true. We know there is like different ways or different forms of hypertrophy, right? We have more myofibrillar hypertrophy, more sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, and obviously more myofibrillar hypertrophy will create a denser muscle in the end because there's more tissue. But that's not to say that with higher volume you cannot still create myofibrillar hypertrophy, right? You can.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at the mechanisms for hypertrophy, mechanical load is one mechanism. The other mechanism is accumulation of fatigue. So if we think about the high volume approaches, perhaps it takes longer to get that myofibrillar hypertrophy. Maybe a lot of the early days stuff is building the sarcoplasm, so it's sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. But I think ultimately the end goal is those guys have got more consistency in their training. There's more longevity in that type of training. And I think ultimately, what stops most people's progress is injuries.
Yeah.
And injuries that are poorly managed. Again, this is no disrespect to physiotherapists and chiropractors and osteopaths and any other therapists out there. But hands-on doesn't fix injuries. It was never designed to do that. Hands-on is used for therapeutic purposes. What you have to supplement your hands-on with is you have to supplement your hands-on with a rehab program. And unfortunately, most therapists are woefully prepared in university to actually do that.
Yeah, so this is actually something I wanted to dig into with you, because I'm really in line with that and like your vision towards rehab. So let's just, if we can kind of sum it up, what is your ultimate blueprint? Like, say, any injury, right? Obviously there's stuff where you need to recover from, like if you had surgery and you need to do like different type of stuff, but let's just pile them all together and say, like, what's the ultimate blueprint? Because usually what people do when they get an injury is either they ignore it for a while, it becomes too prevalent, and then they go to a physiotherapist or a manual or a chiropractor, and they're like, yeah, I just need you to fix me. And then it just becomes an endless cycle of that. That's usually what I see. People go like all that external stuff, like needling, cupping, cracking, massaging, ice baths, you name it, throw it all at it. But I've always found that like this is very like symptom basically treating, which has a place.
100%.
Symptom treating has a value, but it's not what's going to fix the injury. So let's talk about, like, what is your ultimate blueprint for, say, you get injured, what do you need to do?
So I think the first priority is getting a diagnosis. So you see your physio or your chiropractor or your osteopath or your manual therapist for a diagnosis, because until you've got your diagnosis, what are you treating, what are you rehabbing? And then essentially, I would say 90% of bodybuilding injuries are muscle and tendon related. So if we're talking about tendon as the prime example of like 90% of the things that I deal with on a day-to-day basis, you have to, yes, some therapeutic, some hands-on works, maybe some shockwave might help in the early stages of the tendon recovery. But ultimately, what you have to do is address your training program. And I think the blueprint is diagnosis and then use hands-on if needed to kind of deal with the symptomatic sort of, the pain that you get from those symptoms. But then you have to address the training. You have to look at the sort of root cause of the problem. And that's where I tend to sort of interject with people.
Yeah, that's one good top. I had a shoulder injury as well, and I went to a physical therapist who also is in the same line as you are, and he basically said, "Okay, let's go look at how you train."
Yeah.
I went 4 or 5 times. He never touched me.
Yeah.
We just went into the gym, looked how I performed on multiple exercises, and then he said, "Okay, I know what's going wrong here, and let's address your training." And that's what fixed the injury.
100%. 100%. I think you've got to remember, what causes the injuries in most situations is training.
Yeah.
Unless you address the root cause, you're never going to get to the bottom of the problem. And I think the usefulness of your therapist comes in terms of the diagnosis. So they can say to you, you've got, Don's got a long head of biceps tendinopathy, which is essentially there's something wrong with his long head of biceps tendon in the front of his shoulder. It's also caused some changes in the back of the shoulder. So he's got a bit of scapular dyskinesis, which is essentially an alteration of the movement of his scapula. So when he's at rest, I'm going to exaggerate this, obviously. Yeah. It sits like this, which is always a protective posture. Yeah. So when you bench pressing, when you dumbbell chest pressing, you can't keep that scapula retracted. That's what because your brain's trying to protect that tendon.
Yeah.
So I think my job now, if I look back, I've been doing this 30 years now. So if I look back to when I started, it was clinical assessments. So it was hands-on stuff. I was doing orthopedic special tests. I was using tests that have questionable reliability and specificity in terms of diagnosing injuries. And now I tend to work with people. It's either online or it's in person. So we moved into predominantly. I moved away from the hands-on stuff. So we met each other online. So we had an online consultation, and from that consultation, I told you what was wrong with the shoulder, and then we addressed your training program, and essentially that's what's fixing the shoulder. Biologically, it takes around about 12 weeks to reload a tendon in a shoulder or tendon in your body generally. So
that's another interesting thing to go into. But I wanted to dig into that a little bit later, because I wanted to like point out, you just said it yourself as well. You actually had a treatment facility where you did therapy.
Yeah.
And you believe so much in using training for rehab that you actually closed down your manual therapy.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Completely took your hands off of it, which should tell you enough about how effective, you know, your approach can be actually. If
That's
you're
also the issue, right? Most physical therapists, they don't check your posture. They just try to manage the pain or relieve it, and that's it.
I would almost say physical therapy is almost like we're entertaining you until your body gets you better.
Yeah.
So most physical therapists, the first thing they advise you to do is rest.
Yeah.
So what rest does is it reduces the irritation in the tendon or where you've got your injury. So you feel like, okay, well, pain's going down, and you attribute that to therapy that you're having done, the cupping or the acupuncture or the deep tissue massage or whatever it is you're having done. And then when you get back to the point where, let's say, you rested for 6 weeks, because that's a common sort of time frame for people to be told to rest, your tendon has actually become tendon forms. If you looked at a tendon under a microscope, there's these collagen bundles that form in parallel sort of alignments. Yeah. And when we look at a tendon that's become injured, those collagen bundles become a bit like that. So they don't form in those parallel bundles. Therefore, they've got no strength. They've got no tensile strength. So you go back into the gym after your 6-week layoff, having had your physical therapy and doing your banded external rotations for your shoulder. And you start doing a shoulder press and you think, oh, my shoulder feels, you know, pretty much exactly the same as it was prior to you going to spending 6 weeks with your physical therapist. And it got to the point where I felt disingenuous. You know, I felt like it was dirty money, taking money off people for doing hands-on, when I'm telling them in the course of the hands-on treatment, this isn't going to fix your injury. It's like, well, then why do it? And I'm so, I suppose, fixed in terms of this is the approach. The approach that I'm taking now is the approach that you need to take. Because I think all that physical therapy does is, as you say, Don, it treats the symptoms. It doesn't treat the cause.
Yeah. And so if we're going to start looking into training, right? Let's say we deal with bodybuilders, guys like me. They want to train. They want to keep on training. They don't want to stop. They you know, every single day that their injury lasts, just, you know, eats away at them, and so they just want to get back into their comfort zone, I suppose, like zone in terms of training intensity, what they are used to doing as soon as possible. And this is, I think, a big problem, because, you know, you go lay off for 2 weeks, you say you have like a patella tendonitis, right? So in the knee. And you feel that when you do your squat patterns, basically, you mostly feel it with squat patterns. So, but you really like the squat, whatever it may be, hack squat, free barbell squat, whatever. So you lay off of the squats for a week or two, because you know, okay, like I fucked it up. I need to give it some, at least that movement pattern, I need to give that some rest. And then you go back into it after 2 weeks, and you're like, the pain is there a little bit, but I can do it. And then you push through it, and then next day, like, boom.
It's back.
So this is a pattern that, you know, I've seen with myself, with the shoulder. I haven't had in the knee. I'm knocking that off right now. But this is a pattern I see with other people as well. So looking into that kind of scenario, what would you say is the first thing you need to address and realize, basically, being the athlete?
So number one, don't rest. So when you get an injury, resting the injury for 2 weeks, avoiding that movement pattern is generally the worst thing you can do, because what you'll find is collagen, like we talked about with those bundles, it needs mechanical load to help to orientate the collagen. So in the first instance, if the pain's just come on, let's say we're talking about it at that stage where when you warm up, pain goes away.
Yeah.
And then once you've stopped training for like a couple of hours after you've stopped training, you've cooled down, pain comes back again. That's what I'd call the early stage of a tendon injury. Now, if you were to back off on your load for a couple of weeks, keep doing the same movements, but bring your load back down to a point where you're probably only generating about a 2 or 3 out of 10 pain. So if we imagine a pain scale, an imaginary pain scale in our heads, 0 is no pain, 10 is the worst pain you could experience. A 2 or 3 level of discomfort means that you're applying some load to the tendon, which helps with the orientation of those collagen fibers as they're repairing, but you're not exceeding the current load tolerance of that tendon, which is when you get the more acute pain. You know, the next day it's like boom,
Yeah.
as you were talking about. So I think resting tendons is the worst thing you can do. When I hear people saying, I've been told by the physio to take 6 weeks off, it's like, why? Like when you get back in 6 weeks, your tendon is going to be in a worse state of like disrepair than it will be if we back off your training, but keep you in the gym. And I think more importantly, keep your head on, because I think one of the things that, you know, a lot of bodybuilders and a lot of strength athletes generally, part of their personalities, they identify as a bodybuilder, as an athlete, and that's part of their persona. So you take that away from them, and then psychologically they feel low and they feel down. And we know there's a correlation between pain and mood state. So if you're depressed, you've got worse pain. If you're depressed because you can't train, your pain's worse. So it's almost like then a self-fulfilling prophecy. But
I remember that, man. Once I had a back injury, like a couple of years ago, and I got to the point where I went to the GP, because I wanted to get a diagnosis for myself. I remember I just wanted to see, like, give me a fucking MRI so I can see whether there's a disc slipped or not, because I just need to see it. If I see it, then I'll have rest in my head, because right now, I was thinking, like, is it a slip disc? Is it this? Is it this? Just give me a fucking visual. So I go to the doctor, and this guy gives me, I don't know if that's the same thing in English, but it's called diclofenac.
Diclofenac, yeah.
Yeah, so he gives me that, and he says, rest for 2 weeks and just walk on the treadmill.
Yeah.
So I take the stuff, I rest, and I tell you right now, I've instantly felt depressed. Depressed, as in, like, to the point where you just want to head out and do some stupid shit to yourself.
Yeah. Go and smoke some weed in Amsterdam and want some of the cafe.
Yeah, and maybe end up in the canals and live to see.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, I remember.
I think it's interesting. I think the problem is, and I don't really understand the kind of, there will be some neurological changes. So training to failure, the way that a lot of people do with the progressive overload approach, I think it becomes a bit like an addiction.
True.
And when I work with people and I change that I'll try and change that philosophy. In the first few weeks, you were very good, Don. Like, you immediately jumped on board and said, yeah, okay, I'll do what I need to do to get my shoulder sorted. But in the first few weeks of working with somebody, some of the most difficult conversations I have with them are about their need to continue to train to failure, because they think that it's somehow the panacea that's going to give them this incredible physique. Whereas I think what it is, it's more of an addiction. What you're looking for is probably that dopamine hit or that serotonin hit or any of the other neurotransmitters that you produce when you're training. And also, I think the reason why
afraid to lose muscle, right?
Yeah. And I think when you take that away from somebody that's been used to getting those hits every day, what's the first thing that happens? You know, your neurotransmitters crash and your mood drops.
Yeah, I think also because, like Jonathan just said, being afraid to lose muscle. And
that's
the thing we actually started this podcast with. you said, like there's this saying, like, what built the muscle will keep the muscle, and so people are really afraid to let go of one approach and just step over to different. Whereas I think if you break that link, like if you break the link of you can only train this way if you want to keep or gain muscle, and you just let go of that and just, you know, be open to try a different approach, which has been proven by guys like Jay Cutler, Dexter Jackson. We can keep going on. I think
you are the prime example yourself too now.
yeah, I mean, we can go into that obviously, but I think
this is where you take your top off, Don, and show us and make us two feel inferior human beings.
I haven't shaved, so I'll let you guys. But
I haven't shaved for a while either.
I think to be honest, there's more examples of like professional bodybuilders, like actual big guys, training higher volume than there is examples of bodybuilders training lower volume.
True.
Honestly, if we look at the whole history and the whole field, it's starting to change a little bit right now because more people fall into that like JP style training, just to give it a name. But throughout history, man, like most of it's been higher volume training actually.
But do you not think that what we're looking at when we're looking at the upper echelon of bodybuilding, we're looking at genetic freaks, we're looking at the outliers.
Yeah.
You know, if you think about, you know, people like Dexter, I mean, what 50-year-old guy walks around looking like he does? You know, there's not many of them. Jay Cutler, you know, I think what you've got to remember in elite sport is they're elite for several reasons. Genetically, they're gifted in terms of their ability to be able to build muscle tissue. Genetically, they respond to the gear differently. You know, I've interesting conversations with some of the IFBB pros in the UK, and you'd be surprised how little gear they actually take. You know, you're talking a meal a week in the off season of test.
Yeah.
And it's like, so what we're doing is we're drawing comparisons for our own training from people who could probably do anything. They could probably train high intensity, low intensity, high volume, low volume, and they'd still grow because they're the outliers. And I think what I'm
the same result.
Yeah, I think what I'm trying to get across to people is that most of us don't fall into those outlier, you know, whatever those genetic predispositions and differences are. Yeah. We don't fall into that category. And I think it's the kind of people who aren't at the top level that need to hear this message.
Also, if you think about it, like Jonathan, again, I'm coming back to your point where you're saying the people don't want to like let go of that type of training because they identify as a bodybuilder, they identify and they're afraid to lose muscle, right? So if we just take that part, you're afraid to lose muscle. If we know that the current way you're training is causing you injuries, it's causing you to be injured, do you, like, just think logically, do you think that continuing to train that way will get you any further since you're injured already? Like, what the fuck do you want to go and do that? Like, magically.
Think about this from a, like, you know, we've talked a lot about the experiences of other bodybuilders, but if you look at the science, so if you look at people like Brad Schoenfeld, Danas has done some really interesting work about do you have to damage muscle to build muscle. There's three mechanisms they've identified with which we can build muscle. So load is one of them, time under tension is another, and metabolic stress or fatigue is another mechanism by which we can build muscle. Now, I think rather than focusing on one all year round because they're worried about losing size, you've got to be in a position, and I don't know whether you're in this same place at this point, obviously when you get into your off season. When I work with people for an extended period of time, not just with injuries, so I have a few coaching clients that I work with, we have a period of time after prep where we are, I suppose, getting healthy again. We're priming the body. You know, we're coming off the drugs, getting our blood work done. We're addressing any issues we've got in terms of blood work. We spend some time doing some prehab and rehab stuff. So the onus of training starts to change away from trying to build muscle, and it's a sort of preparatory phase. So what I'm trying to do with them is I'm going to get them in the best possible shape I can, so that when we hit the next build phase, there's no injuries. The blood work's good, the calories are high, recovery is good, sleep's good, all the other things that we have to make sure are, on point. And then we run a build phase, and we might run that for 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, depending on the kind of metrics that you measure, HRV, all those various things that we measure in terms of recovery, before we then have a little bit of a period where we back off again, and we allow the body to adapt and absorb the training the training block we've just gone through, before we then push on again. So I think people have this misconception that they can grow all year round, and you can't literally grow muscle all year. You have to prime the body over a period of maybe 6 to 8 weeks post competition, in order to then maximize the use of that building phase.
And also, like, switching those phases. We talked about it, Jonathan, in the last podcast, and Mofo, we talked about it as well in our last call. If like I experienced right now when I switched from doing the top set, back off set into doing 3-4 working sets per exercise now, just increasing that volume, increasing time under tension, building up more fatigue, less nervous system load at once. I made the switch boom. I've been growing for the past 6 to 7 weeks. Which, to be fair, then I started thinking, what if I start changing this in my off season as well? Whereas I start incorporating higher intensity, lower volume blocks paired with higher volume, lower intensity blocks. The two complement each other. They cover all the basics, like pathways for hypertrophy collectively. And it gives the body time, like you say, to absorb the previous block, recover from it, both neurologically and physically, as in the structures, which then kind of, you can't grow year round, but it continuously sets you up to grow whenever you will be able to grow.
When you decide you're going to run a slightly higher cycle and you're going to use the next 12 weeks to put some size back on, you've primed your body ready to go. You're not kind of carrying injuries from the previous build phase. You've addressed those injuries. It's periodization. I mean, what we're talking about here is periodizing your year. Now, I work across a variety of different sports, strength sports, and powerlifters and strongmen are very good at periodizing their years. I think what bodybuilders tend to do is not periodize. There's off season and there's prep. And the only difference between off season and prep for a lot of bodybuilders is in off season, you're eating more food and taking less drugs, and prep, you're eating less food and taking more drugs. But the training style doesn't change. And I think that's a fundamental issue, and I think that's why so many people, like your listeners, will probably testify to this. Prep is the time where you get injured.
Or sometimes you get injured during prep, you don't notice it just yet. You only start feeling it when you come off your prep.
Absolutely.
2, 3, 4 weeks into your post-prep phase, and you're like, oh, I just fucked myself right now. Whereas actually you did that in your prep already.
Because a tendon injury takes multiple weeks to build up, right?
It's 100%. Yeah, I mean, tendons are asymptomatic. Tendons are asymptomatic for weeks. The first thing the first signs of a tendon injury are a little bit of an ache. Let's say it's in the shoulder with Don, like we're talking about Don shoulder. There'll be a little bit of an ache in the shoulder. And that's the first sign that the tendon's becoming disrepaired. It's becoming inflamed. And then that ache becomes an ache that gets worse. And once you've warmed up and you've got into your working sets, it kind of goes away for a bit. And then when you finish training 2 or 3 hours afterwards, after you've cooled down, that ache comes back again, and it's there for 2 or 3 days post-training. And then it gets to the point where eventually the amount of disrepair in that tendon starts to affect your everyday life, picking shopping bags up, food prep, meal prepping, all the kind of basic stuff that we should be able to do pain-free. And yet people are still going back into the gym and trying to train with, you know, their progressive overload, using more load each week, and almost disregarding the what's taking place in that tendon itself.
Yeah. So if we talk about tendons right now, we're on the topic. Can we just get like an overview of like how the tendon works in terms of like, okay, how long does a tendon actually need to recover between sessions? Because this is an important one, training frequency.
Yeah.
We've been talking about volume right now, but training
Yeah.
frequency is also a very important factor when it comes.
Absolutely. So if it takes a muscle approximately, and this depends on age, there's a lot of factors involved in terms of how long things take to recover. So age, there's a certain genetic component, but if we say 48 hours is about the approximate time it takes a muscle to recover from a bout of loading. So back in the days where we used to get DOMs, I don't think anybody gets DOMs anymore when they've been training for a while, do they? It takes twice as long for the tendon to recover from that same bout of loading. So if it's 48 hours for the muscle, it's twice that for the tendon. And then you've got to think, if you're doing a push-pull leg split, when you're doing your pull session, closely following you by, you know, preceded by your push session, you're still using those shoulder tendons. There's still a certain amount of load going through there, even though you're not necessarily working the muscles those tendons attached to. So you're layering kind of damage upon damage upon damage until eventually you get to the point where the rate of damage starts to exceed the rate of repair. And that's when you get tendon problems.
Yeah. And that's the same thing you can use to recover from your tendon problems. So
yeah, 100%. Yeah.
Just think about reversing that process in terms of, okay, let's start to make the tendon repair exceed the tendon damage again, which you do by still training, obviously, but just in a way where you're not creating that much damage to the tendon. And so that's why
I think what we've got it's a difficult balancing act. If you think about, like, what we use in training for is to increase muscle protein synthesis. So that's the adaptation. So if you're not stimulating an increase in muscle protein synthesis around about every 48 hours, because that's how long your window of increased muscle protein synthesis lasts for following a bout of training, then yes, potentially you're going to be impacting your gains. So I don't think you can almost train to allow the tendons to recover. You can't take that much time off, because then you're outside of that window of opportunity for your increased muscle protein synthesis, and obviously your gains are much slower. So I think what you have to do is you have to think about the stimulus that you're using.
Yeah.
So this is where, you know, periodizing the year, maybe using blocks of training where you're using mechanical load. So you're using the JP style training, the Dante Trudel style training, 8 to 12 weeks of that. Then you switch over into some tempo work. So there's a guy called Cal Dietz who's written a book it's called Triphasic Training. Now, originally it was for, I think his original approach was for NFL football players. So this was how they were going to like periodize their year. But what he demonstrated, and what the research since has demonstrated, that really slow eccentrics, we know from, you know, back in the old days we used to talk about focus on the negative. Remember the videos of Dorian training in the cellar down in the gym in Birmingham.
Dungeon.
Yeah, that gym. So focusing on your eccentrics. So you spend then a block of training where you're doing like maybe 3-4 second eccentric lowers on each of your exercises. So you're doing a tempo style of training. Now, tempo training, I can tell you this because I've just finished a block of tempo training myself, is just as hard as increasing load. I'd actually say it's harder, but the load that you're lifting, you can't lift anywhere near the same amount of load. If you're doing a 4-second eccentric on your bench press, there's no way you're bench pressing 140 kilos for a 4-second eccentric if your normal, you know, your normal speed is. So you then have a different stimulus. You then have a different way of continuing to build the muscle.
Yep.
but giving the tendons the opportunity to recover.
Just by adjusting the load, because
Yeah.
you're just
Because you've backed off on the load, you're not now just focused on progressive overload week after week after week after week.
and so I think what you need to understand there, take away from what Aaron just said, is that you can take away load, because load is a tool for, you know, increasing muscle protein synthesis and creating adaptation. Load is one of the tools, and if you pull back on that tool, you can then just push another tool more towards the front end, which now in this case he used tempo training. So just more time under tension will then replace the need for higher load.
Absolutely.
And again, if you're going to lower that tempo, you can also play with other things such as incomplete rest. There's a lot of stuff that you can use, but if you just vary those things, making sure that the recovery of the tendon and the tissues that need to uphold everything is just always staying within that green zone, then you can continue to train productively throughout the year without fucking yourself
Yeah,
up.
I mean, I think if like I suppose my area of interest at the moment in terms of strength sports is powerlifting. So I'm currently just finished a 6-week block of what we'd class as being like a strength block. So I've got a single lift deadlift, the British single lift deadlift championships coming up in May. And I've probably spent 6 weeks where I've been working using doubles, triples, sets of 5, building strength. Now, I think one of the other mistakes people make, and again, I think this is because people have this belief that hypertrophy only occurs in the 8 to 10 or 8 to 12 rep range. We can build strength, which then crosses over into bigger muscles in less than 6 reps. And when you're using big compound movements, like your deadlift and your squat and your bench press, I think it's safer to keep those exercises under 6 reps, because once you get over 6 reps, you start to reach technical breakdown before you reach mechanical breakdown. And you break down technically on a deadlift and you've got 240 kilos on the bar.
Yep.
Well, there's your disc gone. You know, there's your next injury.
So just for the listeners to clarify that, like, how would you describe mechanical breakdown?
So mechanical breakdown is getting to the point where you can't complete another repetition, another concentric contraction with the weight that you're lifting. So a grinder, you know, you get into that last rep and it's real like, so unless you had a spotter, unless there was you got a training partner or somebody who was there to assist you with that little part of the lift, that's mechanical breakdown.
And
Technical break. Was that going to ask what's technical breakdown?
No. What I was gonna say is, like, what you're saying is, like, as if you keep it below 6 reps on those bigger compound movements, there's just less chance for you to reach technical breakdown, but you can still reach mechanical breakdown, because that's, I feel like, a very, like, almost a balancing act there. Because if you're starting to reach mechanical breakdown, and like you just talked about, you're doing a grinder, it is very easy within that to lose your technique as well.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I don't think so. If I'm in my strength block, and this is the same way I would train a bodybuilder if they were in their strength block, I would give them, so let's say it's a back day, it's pull day. So we'd probably have either some kind of deadlift variation or a bent over row variation as our sort of core compound movements and mass builder. Now, what I'm going to try and do with that exercise with that individual is initially we'd start nice and light, but we'd have a higher volume. So we'd be using volume as the stimulation for increased muscle protein synthesis. As the weight gets heavier, we reduce the volume and reduce the number of reps. So the volume decreases as the load increases. But what I'll be trying to do is find a level where they won't reach mechanical failure. They were maybe at an RPE of maybe 8.5. And I think on your compounds, taking those compounds to RPE 8.5, which is what, 2 reps in reserve, I think is safer, because you don't need to take that weight. If you're using, like I deadlifted today, I did 235 kilos for 2 reps. Now I can feel I have done 235 kilos. My body tells me there's an adaptation. I haven't gone anywhere near mechanical failure. It's taken me 6 weeks to get to that stage. But from an adaptive response, there are connective tissue changes, there's muscle changes. And if my goal was hypertrophy and I was feeding that hypertrophy block, then essentially I would be building size and strength at the same time.
Yeah.
And then what you do is you add then your assistance exercises. So you build your session around that one big compound, and then you add your assistance exercises so you can hit the muscle from different angles and different body parts. But what you're doing with those is you're using them almost to get blood flow into the area. So you're trying to improve the sarcoplasmic hypertrophy rather than myofibrillar hypertrophy, which is what your compound's done.
And that's where you create more of that metabolic stress, right?
That's where you create more of the metabolic stress, 100%. Yeah. And it's not as doing it that way, you're not leaving the gym like I've done. So I did my top three sets there. I did a double at 215, a double at 225, a double at 235. And then I went down to 150 kilos. I did 3 sets of 3 with a pause. So a 4-second pause off the floor.
Ooh.
This is again on the deadlift. They're disgusting,
Yeah.
but they build strength and stability like nothing else. I then did 150 kilo box squats for 2x6, and I finished off with some good mornings, 2x8 good mornings with about 100 kilos, and that was my session. That was me done.
That's a lot of like hip loading there.
Yeah, it is a lot of hip loading because my competition requires. So the competition in May is a deadlift only comp.
Yeah.
So, but that's this week. That's my only hip loading session.
Okay.
Monday I have what I'd class as a moderately heavy day. So Monday I squat, I bench, I do the other parts and do some back work. Wednesday I don't lift at all. I do what I call a GPP day, an athletic day. So I do things like box jumps, sled push and pulls. I take the load off my body, off my spine, so that by Friday, like Wednesday is almost like a primer for Friday. And Friday is all about deadlifting and posterior chain. So it's designed to be heavy posterior chain, hip dominant.
Sounds grueling, man, but also fun.
Yeah, and I think if you take the principles of that movement and we apply that to a bodybuilding split, let's take the push-pull leg split, for example. So if you get on with a bench press, if you can connect well with your chest on a bench press, and I think there's reasons why people don't like bench press, well, they don't connect well with it, and that's to do with things like the sternal angle, and then the way that your chest fibers come off the actual sternum themselves. So you find your compound movements that you can progress your load on, and you build your session around that compound movement. So your push session, let's say it's a bench press, that's your heavy compound. That's what you're going to use to build up to, the 5s, the 3s, the 2s, so that you're building strength in the muscles that you're trying to cause myofibrillar hypertrophy in. And then once you've done your 3 or 4 sets of 3, or 3 or 4 sets of 4, or 3 or 4 sets of 5 on that, you then think, right, I've created the stimulus. Now all I want to do is fill the muscle with blood, because with blood comes oxygen, and we need oxygen in order to repair the damage to the tissues we've caused from the training that we're doing. So then you might be doing your dumbbell flies, you might be doing your pec decks, you might be doing, so then you move into your isolation exercises. So you're hitting the body part, the chest and the shoulders from different angles. And then that's your push session. Pull, we talked about your deadlift, so you'd find some variation that works for you. in terms of your own individual biomechanics. Lower body, you know, I think you, as much as I used to say, you can build legs with a leg press and a hack squat. I spent probably 10 years trying to build a set of legs. And it wasn't until I started squatting again that my legs have grown exponentially. And I'm at an age where I shouldn't be able to grow legs. You know, I'm 52 this year.
Really?
I can, dude.
Wouldn't say that.
You wouldn't say that from the looks.
No.
Well, the lighting's very good. I've got one of those.
Yeah.
Got one of those ring lights behind me. My missus has put some makeup on to hide the back.
Sweet,
The
sweet.
wrinkles.
I can actually attest to that myself as well, because last off season before my previous competition, I'd only do hack squats, and maybe some pendulum squats, and my legs just like disappeared.
Inflated.
Whereas previously, even before that, I used to squat, and I'm like, not to sound cocky or anything, I'm just good at squatting. So I really liked squatting as well, which have built my legs in the past. And then I swapped to like the hack squats and all that stuff, and my legs were like my smallest body part in my last competition, where my legs used to be my biggest one. Now this past off season, I've spent my whole off season back squatting, and people are commenting about my legs like, what the fuck happened?
Yeah. What have you done? Are you putting synthol or whatever the Mediform into your muscles?
Yeah.
I think, you know, I think you whether you're trying to build strength or build muscle, because I think it's the same thing. If you're stronger, you can have bigger muscles.
Yeah.
You've got to remember that the basics are where the best kind of your ability to be able to add load and progress the movements come from. You know, your leg press, the leg press is designed. The reason why people can use 500 kilos on a leg press and yet can't squat 120 kilos is because machines are designed to make it easier for you.
Yeah.
Where you get 180 kilos on your back on a squat, you unrack 180 kilos and that's sat on your spine. You think, fucking hell, that's heavy.
Yeah.
And now I've got to squat down and back up again 3 times with that. That's a lot of mechanical stimulus. And I think we're all, I suppose, guilty, me included. I was guilty of wanting an easier way to build my legs, and the leg press and the hack squat. I'm not saying it's easy, because you know you can really hurt yourself on those machines.
Yeah.
But I think there's nothing better. The stimulus you get from a squat is hard to beat it's hard to beat with anything else.
Yeah. And
I
also
changed the hack squat 2 weeks ago into just a normal back squat, and I immediately feel the difference already, just in 2 weeks.
Yeah, 100%.
It's also, I feel like, a more complete builder in general, because with the hack squat, obviously you're taking away a little bit of the stability component, but also you're taking away a bit of like that, we'd call that the frontal plane movement.
Yeah.
For the hips, right?
Yeah.
With a squat, your hips are moving in space. Your hips are moving at frontal plane, where there's, you know, your adductors have to work there, your glutes have to work there a lot more than they have to in a hack squat.
As soon as you introduce something that's you've increased the stability of that movement. So the hack squat, the leg press, because you're lying back on a pad, or you've got, you know, a pad on your shoulders, you've probably reduced the amount of muscles needed to be recruited in order to do that movement. So I think
that's also the reason why they're saying, like, actually, like the more popular opinion at the moment is like a hack squat is more beneficial for hypertrophy versus a free bar squat. That's the more popular opinion right now, because the reason behind of it is like more external stability, meaning you can produce more force in the target muscle, which in this case would be the quads, right? You place your feet super low, you create a lot of knee flexion, you brace it all into that pad, and you focus purely on the quads, which holds some truth, I believe, yes. But I'm thinking, why not do a fucking back squat where there's other muscles involved, you're still training heavy, and you get more all-around growth?
Yeah. And I think if you want to hit, like, if you want to target quadriceps, you do a heel elevated squat. So you're a bit more knee dominant, a bit more quad dominant. You know, I think there's variations of squats so that you don't need, and I think the reason why, because people don't squat, that's why they're having to do like accessory adductor work, you know, specific adductor work, specific abductor work, specific hamstring work, you know, because they're not hitting those body parts with the hack squat.
Yeah.
So like you say, you know, why do 10 movements
If you can do
to
one.
hit all those different muscles that you're hitting in one movement? You're minimizing your fatigue that you're going to accumulate, especially if you're training in that kind of less than 6 rep range. So you're building strength. It takes some skill, so you do have to learn how to squat. And I think, you know, there's a skill component in squatting as well as a strength component. But once you've learned how to back squat, you don't unlearn how to squat. It's like riding a bike. You know, you might be a bit rusty when you start off again, but you keep the loads light, you build your neurological confidence, you build those neurological pathways back in, and essentially you're then back into back squatting and actually building some legs. You know, like I say, I'm 51. I run a little bit of TRT. So I run 125 milligrams a test, primarily for health reasons. And this year, you know, I'm 100 kilos on the nose. You know, if you can't see my arms, but, you know, I'm vascular. It's not like I'm 100 kilos like a lot of powerlifters are. They just tend to be like mass moves mass. I'm still athletic. I can box jump 30 inches. I can, you know, I can run, I can sprint. Yeah, I can squat 180 kilos. I can deadlift 250 kilos. And I think those are testaments of how you build a athletic and strong physique.
Yeah.
100% agree. So Jonathan, you just reincorporated the back squat, so you're getting ready for some fresh leg gains now.
Tomorrow, yeah.
So Aaron,
How did you do that, Jonathan? How did you like reintroduce your back squat?
4 plates straight away.
4 plates straight away. Yeah.
Yeah. No. One day I came in the gym and I had a leg session and I just didn't feel it. So I thought I need to have something to motivate me. So I thought, well, let's do a bit crazy and go back to a back squat and see if I'm still able to do 200 kilos.
And were you?
No, I couldn't. I managed 180 for 4 reps, so that wasn't too bad.
Yeah.
But then I immediately felt like, okay, this is something I didn't feel before during regular leg days, and that's something I've missed too.
There's something very, like, I think we all lift weights for the same reasons, don't we? There's something very primal about lifting big weights. And I think when people hear me talking, they think, oh, I'm against lifting heavy weights. I think it's not that I'm against lifting heavy weights. There has to be periods of time in your training where you're progressively overloading. But I think what I'm against is that progressive overload 12 months of the year. That's the issue.
Yeah. At some point you're just like forcing adaptation where it's not happening.
Yeah, 100%.
And that's where the injuries then come on.
Yeah.
Starting to like we talked about this last time, Jonathan, as well. Like we see people, they're just looking at the numbers. Like we forget about bodybuilding, that it's also about like what's actually happening within the muscle. But they just look at the numbers like, okay, last time I had 8 reps, I need to get 9 reps. And so they would do like 7 reps on a pendulum squat or a hack squat, and then just sit for 10 seconds at the top and like, okay, do one more. Okay, do one more. Okay, great. You did 1 rep more than last week, but like there's no time and retention there. There's no actually buildup of metabolites there in the latter part of that set. Plus, those reps are highly fatiguing from a like central nervous system standpoint, and don't really add a lot to the stimulus at that point anymore. Same with like the guys trying to microload just to force like, I did something more this week, like 0.
Yeah, I did 1.25 kilos to my bench press this week. Yeah.
And like you say, there is a time and place to do that and just hammer it, and then there's a time and place to back off and accumulate more volume and just.
But I think the time and place to do that, like I've spent an off season getting into a place where I can handle 6 weeks of high stress, high load. And, you know, the preparatory period before that was about, yeah, I was doing some squat movements, some squat patterns and some hinge patterns, but they weren't a back squat, a competition back squat. They weren't a deadlift. It was, I was stiff leg deadlifting. I was doing a safety bar, heel elevated squat.
Yeah.
So what I was doing was basically building the foundations from which then I springboarded into my 6-week block of strength, and like have exceeded the goals that I set for myself in this 6-week block.
Sweet.
I doubled. So today I doubled my opener for competition, and that was
230.
yeah. So 235. That's my opener for my competition, and did that with about, it was probably an RP of 8.
Nice. So, Jonathan, do you have any additional questions here?
We had a few, right? Let's see.
I have one question.
Go on.
The skull behind you, like with the wig.
Yeah, that's my wife.
Does
That's
it,
Mrs. Mofo.
is it a it, a he or a she, or a they?
Yeah, that's, so this is what happens when you talk to me. I bore you to death. This is my wife. No, the wig is. I was going to do a skit on Instagram. So my missus is a registered dietitian. She's a performance dietitian. She doesn't practice as a dietitian anymore, but there was some really interesting stuff about pro-inflammatory foods. So things like dairy, sweetener, sugars, artificial sweeteners. So what I was going to do, I was going to do a skit on Instagram, like a sketch on Instagram, where I wore a wig and pretended to be her. And then I was like asking her questions, like the camera cuts between the two of us. So the skeleton is, the wig on the skeleton is just a prop that we were going to use for a sketch.
So does she have a name now since she's wearing it?
So it's Danielle. So this
Danielle.
is Danielle. Yeah.
Good to know. So everybody, all listeners, we have a fourth podcast.
Fourth member of the panel.
Yeah. And we've got Muhammad Ali also in the back.
She's been a bit.
Ali, Mike Tyson.
Oh, that's Mike Tyson.
Yeah.
Oh.
It's not a real. It's not a real picture. They didn't exist in the same era, did they? Unfortunately, that would have been a fight I would have paid to see.
Yeah, that would have been cool.
Yeah, it would have been a good fight.
So, how do you know, like, when you're specifically training on high intensity, low volume? When do you know how to make the switch to higher volume, lower intensity? Like, how do you know when you're under or overloaded on your body, related to pain as well?
So I think what you do is, rather than react to a feeling, so what a lot of people do is they'll push a type of training until the point where they feel like that crushing fatigue. They don't want to go to the gym. Everything aches. They feel that, you know, you don't feel you're exercising your muscles anymore. You're just feeling in your joints. So before you get to that stage, if you've already mapped out, so if we were taking like a year in bodybuilding and you're a competitive bodybuilder, you'd get your competitions mapped out and then you'd reverse engineer back from that point. So essentially you'd construct your year around a post prep period where people tend to think about the rebound, which is basically just because you're eating more food is the reason why you rebound. You use that period to get healthy, get your bloods done, get all that stuff done, you know, sort out any niggles and injuries that you've got. You then move into a build phase, you know, you move into that thing. So rather than waiting for your body to display symptoms that you need to change the style of training, you program those things in.
Yeah.
Like I know now, so this is the sixth week of my training block. I could do a 7th week, I could do an 8th week, I could do a 9th week, because I'm managing the fatigue really well. But I know that it's a law of diminishing returns. Next week, you know, 235 will feel heavier than it felt today. And from a powerlifting perspective, from a strength perspective, you know, once it starts, you start to grind those reps and they're not moving with speed, then essentially you're losing some of the stimulus. You're and increasing the amount of fatigue that you're accumulating. So I think rather than getting to the stage where people are feeling the symptoms of doing things for too long, lifts might start to plateau. That might be one way of telling. And instead of swapping out a lift for something else, maybe it's time then you have a change of stimulus.
Yeah.
And it doesn't require, when we talk about stimulus change, it doesn't require a program change. It just requires you to do different things other than adding load. So you can run the same program for 12 months of the year, but you'd have 8 weeks where you're working on volume. You might have 6 weeks working on strength. So you're working in a lower rep range. So all you were doing on that program is adjusting your sets and reps to accommodate what you're trying to achieve from that particular block of training. And then you might have a period of time where you've done your strength block. So you then move into a block of tempo training, and you're doing like super slow eccentrics and pauses and those kind of things, those disgusting things.
Yeah. All right.
I think that wraps it up nicely. Don't want to take too much of your time, Mofo. We've been at it for more than an hour already. Jonathan and I are going to do some back squats tomorrow.
Yes.
Just do me a favor, Jonathan. Just back off your load. Learn your movement patterns first.
Yeah.
So
in general, I'm pretty good in back squatting. At least I was. But you know how bodybuilders are, right? They try to jump back in where they left off.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you've got to remember, we don't lose strength very quickly. Like you, as you've demonstrated, you're not doing 200 kilo back squats, but you're doing a 180 back squat.
Yeah.
Now that's after, I don't know, a few years.
4 years. 4 years.
4 years, right?
Yeah.
So in terms of strength, you've lost very little. You've lost a bit of top end strength. But what you've lost more so than anything else is those neurological pathways that fire when you squat. So pushing to 180 means that you're potentially exposing yourself to more risk because your body doesn't remember how to squat. It's a bit like riding a bike. When you haven't ridden a bike for a while, it takes a little bit of time to kind of get back into the groove of what you're supposed to be doing and steering and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I think your compound movements need to be done in exactly the same way. So if you've not deadlifted or squatted or benched for years, start light. Use those almost like, keep your hack squat in or your pendulum squat in for the load and the kind of stimulation, and just keep your back squat or your deadlift. Put that at the start of your session when you're fresh. Use small amounts of load and gradually build that load up over the course of a few weeks. When your nervous system starts to become more efficient at producing the movements, till eventually you then replace your pendulum squat with a squat, or whatever you're doing for back with a deadlift, or whatever you're doing for your chest with a bench press. Yeah. So these things can kind of run in the background whilst you're building that load back up to a stage where you're getting the stimulation that you want.
So here's the hard part. How is he going to do that mentally tomorrow when I'm going to be doing 5 plates a side?
Yeah. But that's coming back to the point we made earlier in the podcast, right? Afraid to lose strength or to lose muscle.
Yeah, I think so.
The ego part.
Yeah.
As you've just demonstrated, in 4 years you've lost 20 kilos worth of strength, which is I would say is just down to the fact that your movement patterns are rusty. Neurological movement patterns are rusty.
Yeah.
Muscle. So unless you're on the International Space Station and you've got zero gravity,
where there's no gravity,
muscle takes, we are talking months to lose. Yeah, you might look a bit flatter because when you're training regularly, your muscle's being pumped full of glycogen and blood. But actually, you don't lose muscle that quickly. So when people say to me, 12 weeks, all my muscle's going to fall off. Well, like I say, unless you lived in a zero gravity environment, that's highly improbable.
Yeah. We'll see you tomorrow, man.
Yeah.
We'll see you tomorrow. Anyway, I want to thank you, Aaron, for jumping on here.
No, you're absolutely welcome. Absolutely welcome. It's been a pleasure.
Hope
Pleasure
you guys have been listening. enjoyed the podcast, learned something. If you want to reach out to Aaron, check out his Instagram. It's MoFoBodyMechanic. If you currently have injuries and you need help, Aaron can do that remotely. He can teach you a lot about how to train around it, how to, new ways of training, new ways of stimulating your muscle without aggravating your injuries, getting you back on track, making you feel better because you don't have pain anymore. I'd highly recommend it because, I'm doing it myself, and it's been very helpful. So check him out for sure. And then we're going to be seeing you guys in the next episode, or you're going to be seeing us, basically.
Thanks for your time, man, and we'll speak soon.
Yeah, speak soon. Nice to meet you, Jonathan.
Yeah, likewise.